It's really wonderful to be here. I am the professor of evangelism at Southern Methodist University, Perkins School of Theology in Dallas, Texas. And I'm also the co-founder of the Missional Wisdom Foundation, which is a nonprofit that administers learning communities that are contextualized ministries that are also places for theological learning. And those emerged right out of my attempts to help my students who were sitting in my office crying and asking if they should leave the church so they could answer God's call. And they were feeling called to take the church beyond the walls of the church and needed a place to test out their call, to figure out what in the world they were going to be doing, which increasingly the percentage of young seminary students who are coming fall into that category. So I found myself 10 years ago in the middle of what's now kind of a tidal wave in terms of how many young adults are in seminary who are feeling called beyond the walls of the church, or don't feel called to do the traditional things that we've thought of as church, you know, from the time we were children. And so, so the work of the Missional Wisdom Foundation came out of my classroom, and these two things inform each other now. So I've been involved in all kinds of interesting experiments and have worked with many annual conferences in the United Methodist Church, and I'm working with the Episcopal Church now in the U.S. and other places too beyond the U.S. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight, that I've been asked to talk with you and facilitate conversation after I do a presentation regarding confidence in faith sharing. So this is an interesting thing that I've been asked to do because I just read a study, a report of a study last week that came out, the Church of England did, called Talking Jesus. Did you see this in the Guardian? They did a little article about it, a not very flattering article. And apparently over 470, I think congregations were consulted, I may have that wrong, but there were 470 voices contributing to this study. And what they were trying to find out was, what are the results when lay people in the Church of England share their faith with people who are not a part of a church, who don't, are not involved with a relationship with God? How does that go? What is the effectiveness of faith sharing with people who are not Christians, people who are secular, etc.? And what they found was very distressing, that persons, if a person shared their faith verbally with somebody else, that person was 3 times more likely to never come to faith in Christ than they were to be interested. So in other words, they discovered that the verbal faith sharing was somehow alienating to people. And a person was more likely to respond to Christ or to be interested if somebody hadn't been sharing their faith. So clearly, the problem is, how are we sharing our faith? How are we doing this? And why is it that the way these folks had learned how to share their faith is no longer effective? In fact, it's alienating. So we need to look at that as we look at ways to share with confidence, because we don't want to keep doing that, right? I hope not, anyway. I hope not. So maybe we can start over here, and some ways that we learned how to share faith. I know when I first became a Christian, I was 16. I did not grow up in the church. Went to Sunday school once in a while if a neighbor would take me. It was hit or miss. My parents were pretty hostile to the faith. They would have been good citizens here in the UK as far as their attitude to the church is the secularization. My parents would have fallen into that category. So when I first found faith in Christ, I was taught in my Wesleyan holiness tradition that I came into the church in, that you should present people with the gospel. We had the 4 spiritual laws. Do you have those in England too? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we had the 4 spiritual laws, and well, SL, that's not Saturday Night Live, that's spiritual laws. And we had these tidy little booklets that you could open up with your neighbor, and you could walk them through these little line drawings, and at the end they had to choose heaven or hell, and you urged them with your heart, to choose heaven. And then you even had a prayer that you would have them repeat after you. Do you remember this? Mm-hmm. So there was this sort of urgency with these 4 spiritual laws that you're all doomed. And if we don't come to Christ like I have, you're going to hell. Mm-hmm. And don't you want to go to heaven someday? So there was this focus on heaven someday. and not much focus at all on heaven or hell that we encounter day by day in our life. So in other words, there was no realized eschatology going on here. It was all someday. So this was what we did, and it seemed to work with some people for a period of time. Sometimes this was done with a lot of pressure, a lot of shaming, damning, guilting, all those things that are appalling, right? But sometimes it worked. Then we also had the attracting people. Now, when I first came to faith, right before I came to faith, there was a girl in my class at school who invited me to go to her church. This is before I came to faith. It was the year before. She said, I want you to come to church with me on Sunday because we're having a competition between the boys and the girls. And whoever brings the most people to church gets the pizza party, paid for. And so I said, I can do that for you. So I went, and the girls won the pizza party. They were more successful. So what was going on there in a very sort of rudimentary way was we'll attract people so that we can get what we want out of the people. We'll hold programs for them. We'll do things that are attractive to people. We'll even use gimmicks and stunts. We'll do that sort of thing to get people to come into the church. And the idea here was we want to attract people into the church building with its programs and activities. And once they get in there, maybe they'll become Christians. That's our hope for it. And so this attracting people into the building with programs and activities. And then if you can get them looped into one of those activities so they keep coming, and pretty soon they're kind of spinning around inside this vortex of activities. And we thought that was a good way to evangelize, but this is completely losing its ability to work for many people. To many people, this feels like, and has functioned as a sort of consumer activity. From the church side, we wanted to attract people, so we developed programs and activities that will attract people. I live in Dallas, Texas, the buckle of the Bible Belt. And we've got mega churches there. Even the Jehovah's Witness church is huge. It's just very interesting. Although even in Dallas, we're beginning to see secularization. We're beginning to see numbers shrinking and this kind of thing. But some of the big churches that I've been in that have 13,000 members, 15,000 members, which is truly mind-boggling. They look like resorts with, marble foyers and all this kind of thing. The children's ministries, I've seen some of the children's ministry wings that look like Disney World, that have Disney-themed artwork and activities, and it's very high-tech. And so the idea with these kinds of things, and then you have your coffee kiosk in there, and everything it's like a shopping mall in some ways. The message that's being preached is usually preached well. It's usually interesting. The music is usually professionally done. It's very, very professional. But the sort of vibe that can come through that is we're attracting customers. People will come here instead of that church down the road because we have the Disney-like children's ministry, or we have our youth go on a ski trip. They don't just sit around and do boring things. So we've had this consumer approach. And then if you look back further in our history as a church, we had the whole colonizing way. In North America, for example, where I live, 95% of the indigenous people were killed, their cultures destroyed. They were killed by the colonizing activity that happened in North America. And we're still struggling to rectify all of that. We're still struggling with a lot of social dislocation, particularly in Oklahoma. So we have the history of colonization, and it went on all over the world. And this still happens in some ways when we attract people into the church. Let me just do a little drawing. You can't even see these, can you?
That's fine. I'm listening.
Mm-hmm. So we'll call this the C+C church, the consuming and colonizing church. We'll put the cross here so we remember it's the church. Right? And so what happens with this kind of church is we have all these things going on inside that will attract people. And once they get in there, It becomes kind of like a tornado that spins around and sucks everything into the inside. It's not a hurricane that turns around and spins things out. It sucks things in. And so people come in and get involved in here, and the longer they're in here, and this becomes their place where they hang out when they're not asleep or at work, their whole social life is colonized. And then the longer they're in here, the fewer friends they're likely to have out here from wherever it is they came from. They're removed from their cultures out here, have to learn a new language to be in here, a whole new sort of subculture that they become a part of, and it separates them from wherever it is they came from. So the longer they're in here, the less likely it is they're going to be able to impact anybody out here, because the relationships are not robust. They don't have time and so on. Okay, so these are all ways we've shared our faith in the last 100 and more years. And these are all ways that are losing the capacity to reach anyone for all sorts of reasons. So far, so good? Okay, so now we're going through a time of massive culture shift, which is unprecedented in that it's global, it's truly global, and it's being pushed along by changes in communication and information technology. We have the internet now, we have cell phones now. Somebody in sub-Saharan Africa can open up their cell phone and we can Skype together. They've bypassed computers there, they just went right to the smartphones, right? So we've got that, and then our economy has changed. The new nations are not geographic nations, they're transnational corporations. And that's where neo-colonialism comes from, right? All of that. So we're in a time of rapid, massive culture shift. And the church, which for the last 100 years has gotten used to thinking of this as normal, this is how we share our faith, the church is struggling to figure out what in the world, somebody pulled the rug out from under us. How do we share our faith in such a way that it's winsome, that people want to know more, people are attracted to Jesus? So what I think is really going on now is we're at the front end of a new great awakening, a third great awakening, that will be global in nature, that's going to be more powerful and reach more people than the first and second great awakenings did. But it's going to look really, really different. It's not going to be because of powerful preachers who stand in a pulpit and have thousands of people. It's not going to be about that. It's going to be more like the spread of thistle seeds on the wind. And you think about thistle seeds, they're just tiny. They look fluffy and soft and innocuous. They're just so pretty. But a thistle seed can lodge anywhere, and a plant can grow. It can lodge in your wall, in the little cracks between the mortar and your wall, and all it needs is a little bit of water, a little bit of soil, and some sunlight, and that plant will grow, and the roots will take root deep inside that crack in the wall. So what's going to happen, and has already begun to happen, and we're going to see more and more of it, is new forms of church emerging. Most of them are really ancient forms of church. Some of them are truly new. Having online church is a truly new thing. But many forms of church that are really diverse, that are carrying the gospel, the wine of the gospel, if you want to think about wine and wineskins, but carrying them in different containers, and they're going to have different shapes in all sorts of interesting places. And the similarity between the way the church is going to look in this new thing that's emerging is that where it's actually carrying the gospel, where it's not just a thing that flashes and then burns out and doesn't accomplish anything, but the expressions of church that are emerging that are going to have a permanent impact, that are going to carry forth the gospel into the next generation, will have these characteristics. They're going to actually be Eucharistic. And by that I mean there will be a retrieval of our understanding of ourselves as the church, not as a consuming activity, not as a colonizing activity, but us becoming the bread and the wine that are broken and given to the world. Truly, where we understand ourselves as God's sent out people. Which is what apostle means. That's that New Testament, the Greek word that just means the sent out people. So there will be some characteristics that are similar in very different kinds of communities for the ones that I believe will actually carry the gospel, will share faith in a convincing and confident way. And it will have everything to do with our being gathered together, being blessed by God, experiencing God, being sort of a multi-grain loaf, right? And then God opening us up, breaking us up, and giving us in our local neighborhood where these little communities are. So let's look at this systems change a bit more, and then we'll come back to some characteristics, what the faith sharing is going to look like. And we're there now. We need to start doing our faith sharing this way now. But I'm also talking about as we're moving into the future what it's going to look like, because we're in a huge transition. So this diagram that I'm going to show you is not original to me. I saw it when I was doing some research on systems change, how systems change. And so this is a diagram from Deborah Fries, who's a systems change theorist. And her work doesn't focus on church systems, it focuses on energy systems and education systems and sort of institutional systems, not particularly about religious systems. But when I was doing this research and I saw this diagram, I instantly recognized, oh, that's what's happening with us. This is so very helpful to see it in this way. So if you imagine the red line being the system that we inherited, the system, the inherited church that we grew up in or we came into, whenever a system is getting better at what it does, you know, it's kind of on the ascent. It's getting better at what it does, it's gaining capacity to influence, it's becoming more elegant in how it does what it does. Okay, so it's ascending. But what happens is just before a system peaks out in its capacity to do what it does, and this is just something that happens always. Before a system peaks out in its capacity to do what it does, there are people, here, these purple dots, individuals usually, sometimes little groups, but often it's individuals, who are forward thinkers in the church. In the broad tradition of the church, these are the apostolic people. These are the pioneers, the innovators. These are the John Wesleys. These are the Martin Luthers. These are the Apostle Paul, who's speaking back into the people in his own tradition, the Jewish church, and saying, "No, wait a minute, Gentiles, you're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you. It's going to blow your mind. Gentiles don't have to become Jews, so he's speaking to them. Okay, so these folks see what's coming. They start to speak up as individuals. They begin to generate a little bit of energy. They don't know each other yet. And nobody cares at first because the system hasn't crashed yet. So nobody cares at first when they begin to speak up to them. They're like the hippie weirdos, oh, that eccentric. Oh, isn't that nice? They're sort of trivializing and ignoring and that sort of thing. But as time goes by and the system has peaked and it's beginning to decline because it's really not sustainable. This is not sustainable. We all know this, right? That study that came out called Talking Jesus from the Church of England, this is not sustainable. It's really not. The system, what starts happening now is these people that were just kind of eccentric weirdos on the edge now feel very threatening. Very threatening. And the reason why is the system goes into anxiety as a system. There's sort of corporate anxiety because of loss of financial support, loss of bodies, this sort of decline, the memory of what used to be. When you read Zechariah, I don't know if you've read Zechariah recently, but remember they were going to build the new temple, and there were people who remembered the old temple, and they were crying and complaining. And remember in Zechariah, I think it might be in chapter 4, and God raises the question, do you despise small beginnings? Because they're remembering their glorious beginning. And so there's this sort of negative energy that is misplaced. Because when we go into anxiety, there's a profound broken human need to scapegoat somebody for something, right? René Girard has written about this in his work. But so there's a tendency to begin scapegoating these change agents as being responsible for this. Have you seen this? Negative talk. I've seen people who go into a mental breakdown because of the pressure of the system to crush the spirit in them. And these are people that God is calling forth. This is why the Apostle Paul got stoned and, beat up, and, Wesley was run out of town and don't you ever come back, that kind of thing when you read his journal. So the pressure is trying to push the innovation down with the sort of unrealistic hope that if all those change people will go away, we can get back to what we used to do and all will be well. And that's not going to happen. It's really not. But the problem is, this is a systemic pressure, it's systemic anxiety, and it's not like you can just have one person change their mind and everything will now work smoothly. We have a whole system to deal with, because our system developed based on this stuff. And where in the world do you start changing the system? How do you do that? It's difficult. So what happens as these people are continuing, there are more of them that start to innovate. In order for them to actually be able to fulfill their call and lead the church forward through this systems change, they need to start connecting with each other for moral support, to tell each other their stories, to pray together, to be more than just one person doing this thing. It feels like when you're a pioneer, when you're doing pioneering work, apostolic work, it can feel like Elijah after he had that episode with the prophets of Baal. Do you remember this? And he was just so exhausted. And here he'd had this showdown with the prophets of Baal, and God had come through. And he goes off into the wilderness and says to God, kill me now, I can't take this anymore, I'm the only one. And God said, no, you're not, there's 7,000 others. But he didn't know, because they weren't with him. The only one he knew that was doing the stuff was himself. And so that's very alienating, especially with the pressure of the system, and it can feel overwhelming. So the pioneers, the innovators, need to connect with each other. And as they begin to connect, this is going down. This green line represents what's new that's emerging. And again, let me say this, that what's emerging now is very diverse. It's not one thing. Even during the Protestant Reformations, we didn't have just one Reformation, right? We had Luther, we had Calvin, we had Menno Simons, and then we had odd people like the Lawler. We had all these sort of different groups of people. We had different streams within it. So there's like a multitude of streams that are emerging right now. So as this is going down and more of these folks come up and they begin to connect with each other, the system loses the capacity to crush this new movement. Does that make sense? It just doesn't have that capacity anymore because of the shift of energy and shift of stories, frankly, stories of what is it that's going on. So they come out from under the capacity to be crushed by all of this, although some people never make it through. Within the ones who are coming out now, and they're becoming robust and getting better at what they're doing. They're learning how to have a healthy community. Let's say they're community organizers like Shane Claiborne. They're realizing, you know what, we have to have a regular prayer practice or this thing we're doing isn't going to last. So they're getting better at what they're doing. Some of them have a God-given call, opportunity, gift to speak back into the system. They're actually invited now to speak back into the system that once tried to kill them. Isn't that something? And so what they do when they're invited is to come and speak back into the system and say, come and see what we're doing. Just come and have a look and let's talk about it and have coffee. Let's go have a beer. We're going to talk about what's happening here. And so they invite people in the system to come and see. And this is so terribly important because if you've read about adaptive leadership and all of that, when you're doing some kind of a change, it's like 2 or 3% of people can get it at the front end, the early adapters. Everybody else can't figure out what is the new thing until they see the new thing. So somebody has to create the new thing for other people to see. That's the toughest work, creating the new thing for other people to see, because you have to do all this pioneering work. But now, when the other people can see it, a large number of them will say, oh, we could do something like that. We can figure this out. And now there's this sort of positive, we can move forward. There are some people at the other end of the bell curve who will never agree to it, even if the Trinity stands before them and says it in the flesh. They're just naysayers. And so as we're moving through all this, we have to accept that 100% of people won't get it, and it's okay. There are people that don't want to get it. So we just love them and we move forward anyway. So what happens here as this is all going on? Deborah Fries talks about this. This is a special category of people here, these sort of blue caterpillar people. And we need them at this phase of the old system's decline. These are institutional leaders who have a very special role to play. And many institutional leaders just are not able to play this role. And let me describe what the role is. But some people need to play it, and some people, just having a few people play it well is enough. So these people are both and thinkers. They are institutional leaders who can see what's going on. They see the big picture. They know what's coming, more or less. We don't have the whole end game, but they know that this is declining and it's time for it to decline. They understand there are people in this system who are never going to make this shift. And they love those people. And they do their best to make sure those folks are tended well, who are going to stay in that system for the rest of their lives. So they make sure, they use their power to make sure that happens, but they also understand the vital importance of the innovators, the apostolic people. And so while they're making sure these guys are tended, they are also protecting the innovators, the pioneers. They're making space available. They're making resources available, sometimes money, but really the biggest resource, the biggest gift that's needed from these folks is a blessing. It's a blessing. So in my church, we have bishops, and having a bishop who blesses the innovation is so critically important to it moving forward. The blessing is almost more important than having a space to meet and having some money. We can come up with spaces and money, but the blessing helps to greatly reduce this negative pressure that's crushing. So blessing, and also these institutional leaders who play this role help to tell the story of the new thing that's happening and help to connect these guys back here. They help with this liaison right here. This is a really, really hard role to play. Really hard. This can be a local pastor. Anyone with institutional power can be in this role, doing this. But what happens when you're in this role is you're in the crosshairs of all the tension. You're like right in the crosshairs. And so how do we get through that? Those of us who are in that, and sometimes I'm in that role, depending on which group I'm with and what I'm actually doing. So in the crosshairs, where we're in the very center of the anxiety, we're pulled by opposing groups, and we're also getting accusations from opposing groups. So we have to do our own work on our inside ourselves. We need to take care of our own unfinished business, because when you're in that kind of situation, your issues surface. So we need to give high priority to our own spiritual formation, our own prayer practice. We need a spiritual director. We may need a therapist to support us while we're going through this. We may need a coach. We may need all three of those support people. But we need that kind of support. We have to attend to our own issues. We need to make sure we're getting enough rest, drinking enough water, playing. Really, the sort of basic self-care things, because this can just take you out if you're not taking good care of yourself. Edwin Friedman has written a book. It came out probably, I'm thinking 20 years ago, and there may be a revised edition. He's no longer living, but it's called A Failure of Nerve. Have you ever read that book? A Failure of Nerve. I really recommend that. If you're in this kind of role, you need to read that book, A Failure of Nerve. You can also watch little sort of animated YouTube clips that summarize a failure of nerve. There's one called The Differentiated Leader. that I recommend you look at. You can Google that, the differentiated leader. So, and what he's talking about really, Friedman, is that the differentiated leader is able to go into a system that's anxious, that's upset about things, and not get sucked into triangles with other people, but actually be present to everyone and be present to ourselves and be able to exercise wisdom and discernment as we're leading. So that's a resource that I recommend to you if you're in this space. So Deborah Fries calls this the Hospice Caregivers, which I think is kind of an odd name because it's, well, partly because the system's not completely going away. It's not all dying. It's being transformed. But I think why she chooses that name is that when this person's playing their part in a healthy way, they're reducing the pain of the transition. Does that make sense? Well, some things need to die and fall away and other things are being born. So that's what she calls that person. Let me see if I can. Okay, so this space right here, if you imagine a circle drawn right here, this space is the most problematic space to be in. It's the most painful. It feels like chaos and confusion. It feels like the dark night of the soul that will never end. It feels like fog. Whether you're an innovator or you're this person or you're an angry lay person or whoever you are, down in this space when this has declined, this is not quite formed very well, it all feels very nebulous. It feels like confusion, chaos and confusion. And you wonder, is this ever going to end? Where are all these experiments going? I've seen those fresh expressions things, they're ridiculous. I mean, it's the sort of talk about the new thing and then feeling frustrated and disgusted with what we used to do. This isn't working either. Right in this space, a lot of people leave the church. Clergy leave ministry and go get a job at the coffee shop. People say bad things to each other, hateful emails, all of that. So what I remember when I think about this space being chaos and confusion is in Genesis 1, when God's creating the earth. It says the earth was formless and void. Remember that? Formless and void. Which, interesting words. Formless and void is tohu vavohu. If you remember from Hebrew, if you had Hebrew in your education, tohu vavohu, which is translated differently in different English Bibles, but this literally means, in Hebrew, it literally means chaos and confusion. And it's actually chaos and confusion are God's building blocks for creation. And to me, that's such a hopeful thing. Any time in our lives we're running into chaos and confusion, this is a space where God can work to call forth new life. And I really believe with all my heart that's what's going on here. God is calling forth new life. And in the creation story in Genesis 1, that version in particular is this sort of ordered life, life upon life, and then the climax of all of that is worship. It's joy and rest and looking back and saying, isn't this beautiful? And I think that's where we're going with this. Oh, one last thing about this that I wanted to say. Phyllis Tickle talks about this in The Great Emergence. Whenever there's a major shift in how the church is, she refers to the Reformations, for example, the old system doesn't disappear. I mean, certain aspects of it do. We no longer have people in the Catholic Church selling indulgences, for example, right? At least not that I'm aware of.
Oh, we do.
We do? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Italy, yeah.
A different way? Okay. Wait till Pope Francis finds out, right? So what happens is the old system is no longer dominant. That's what changes. And so there's some aspect of it that's still there, but it's no longer dominant. And it goes through its own cleansing. So it has a somewhat different texture as time goes by. It doesn't dominate, and it's different. With the Catholic Church, there was the Counter-Reformation. So it continues while the new thing emerges. Now let me just nuance this a little bit. The new thing that's emerging now, as I said, is diverse, it's multiple forms. One form that's emerging that I'm seeing here in the UK with fresh expressions is fresh expressions. To me, you can tell me if I'm getting this right or wrong. There's an intentional effort, and this comes from Rowan Williams and others who've been working on this, that the fresh expressions of the church will still be anchored in the existing church. Does that sound right to you? So what will happen here is, keep that in your mind, okay? That was the consumer church that looks like a tornado. So now one of these new things is, here's our church. So I call this anchor church, where there's a shift in how the gathered church functions into a more New Testament way, frankly. So we'll still have this, but now one of the things, so now fresh expressions, I'll put those out here, okay? So you might have a local congregation. We'll pretend its name is St. Mark's. And you'll still have a gathered community that meets here. They might still have a church building, and they might have an organ, and they might have some of those things that we're used to, or they might not. This might be a large congregation. It might have 300 people, or it might have 100 people. It doesn't, it's not a numeric thing. It's an ecclesiological thing. So this would still fit into this, and yet it's anchoring these kinds of communities that are out here doing interesting things in different places. And this one looks really different. This is in an art area. And this one is with bikers. And this one up here is the yoga granola people, the vegans. And down here we've got some kids, and so on. Now this is over at a pub. They do pub theology. And so in one of the things that's emerging is a sort of hybrid between those things that are way out there, but they're still anchored in the institutional church in a very localized way. So that's one of the ways this seems to be evolving. This is very tricky because you have turf wars. Who gets to count these people? Who's in charge? Who's serving the sacraments? We've got sort of things that we have to sort through. So what will faith sharing with confidence look like as we're moving into the future with these realities? And you'll have to think about this in your own context. Well, one characteristic is biodiversity. This kind of shows in this particular context so the pub people and the granola people may not get along with each other at all, and these guys and these clearly are from completely different planets. But the gospel can be carried to them in their own context, with their own language, their own social references, and all that kind of thing. So the biodiversity is going to become more and more noticeable. Church is going to look really different under the bridge than it does at my kitchen table and over around the corner. And yet, it will carry the gospel forward. So our work, those of us that are in the established church, part of our work is to celebrate the biodiversity. The most healthy places on planet Earth are the most biodiverse places. The places where you're going to see the most new life and interesting life forming are called ecotones. Have you heard of this? Ecotones. An ecotone is where you have an overlap of two ecosystems. For example, an estuary where the freshwater river's flowing into the ocean, and you've got that place of mixing of those two ecosystems, and you'll just have this really interesting abundance of life, which this form of emergence has the potential for that, because this is sort of an ecotone. Can you see that? Two different ecosystems. Rowan Williams refers to mixed economy. It's kind of getting at the same thing. So we also know from the natural world that the most unhealthy places on planet Earth are the ones where the biodiversity's been destroyed by human activity, right? By pollution, by factory farming, all that kind of thing. So we have that metaphor that we can work with, but this biodiversity, we need to help ourselves and the whole church understand this is a beautiful thing from God. This is something to embrace, not to resent. What does that mean on the ground? It means that if you're pastoring this church, your job is to interpret to the people for whom what happens inside this building is church. To interpret for them, this is also church. The yoga people on Tuesday night, that's church too, because they're being led by, it's a Christian initiative here, that this counts too. To help, our job is to help eliminate these turf wars. The whole turf mentality is related to consumer church. We can see that, right? That sort of competing, colonizing, owning, that kind of thing. A second feature of what's emerging that will help us be able to share our faith with confidence is that it becomes the work of the people and not the work of the clergy. We're going to have a God's people-centric church rather than clergy-centric church. Now again, this is a reversal of how we've been trained to think. We've been trained to think that ministry is a professional activity that requires a master's or a doctoral degree. Just like if we were doctors or lawyers, or that we've professionalized ministry, and in many ways, we've stripped away the gifts and power that the Holy Spirit has given to lay people to do the ministry. So a retrieval of what it teaches in Ephesians 4, that the minister's job, the pastor's job, is to equip the people to do the ministry. That's our work as ordained people. Equip the people to do the ministry. The meaning of liturgy, that ancient meaning of the word liturgy, was the work of the people, the average citizens, for the common good of the community. It wasn't even a religious word. Liturgy, that's what that word means. So we'll have to move back to that understanding, retrieve that. And to me, this is very, very exciting. But that's partly because my work is to equip people for ministry. That's what I get paid for in my professor job, equip people for ministry. And I'm equipping you. I'm here to help equip you. So that's part of it too. We particularly will be equipping people to live well in their own neighborhoods, to live intentionally in their own neighborhoods, where they work, where they live, the house they live in, the street they live on, the apartment building they live in, so that they're forming relationships with their neighbors. They have space in their schedule to have their neighbors over for dinner, to do life with their neighbors, because our neighbors get to watch how we live when we get to know them. We've gotten away from that a lot in the U.S., and from what I'm hearing, it's happened here too, where we drive somewhere to church and the church happens in the building, and we may not know our neighbors at all. Certainly don't talk about our faith with our neighbors, but when we can retrieve this living in the neighborhood thoughtfully, intentionally, where we get to know our neighbors, we're involved in the local school, and so forth, then that's the ground where we have real relationships with people. They get to see how we live. And every relationship that's a real friendship involves lots and lots of talking, right? The sharing of our lives, our hearts, our hopes, our hurts. And in that process of doing life together and sharing who we are, we have many opportunities to talk about why God is important to us and how we've experienced God. So teaching people the practices of hospitality, that's part of this right here, the practices of justice. And then finally, signs and wonders in the book of Acts, when the apostles were sent out, and there's that word again, the sent out people, their words were confirmed by signs and wonders, by action. And people didn't really trust what they were saying until they saw the action. So in the book of Acts, we hear these stories of people being healed from physical ailments, from spiritual ailments, people that were oppressed being delivered from the oppression, and so forth. And those miracles caused people to sit up and take notice. So I look around our cultures today, our landscape, and I ask myself, what kind of signs and wonders would be very convincing to people today? Would cause people to sit up and say, I need to spend some more time with those Christians. I need to understand better what it is that makes them tick, because this is fascinating. And here's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about our global world. I'm thinking about the increase of religious violence, or what people perceive as religious violence. We have all this stuff that's going on right now in Europe, in Paris, and then all the anxiety all over Europe because of terrorism. It's in the U.S., and many of our governors are acting badly, including the governor of Texas. And in the U.S., we have all of the terrorist activities that have been carried out by American citizens have been carried out by white male Christians, Christian extremists, a type of religious violence. And of course, that gets all the press, right? So we're in a culture, in a climate now where there's sort of an extreme focus on religious extremism that's always violent. And people are backing away from religion in general because of this. We're also in a time with so much social media and everybody knows everything all the time, that any polarization in the church is quickly broadcast. And so all of the polarization and hateful talk around sexuality, that's out there sort of splitting people apart and making the church look more and more unappealing. And there are other issues like that, the poverty. Pastors, this is more of an American phenomenon, but pastors who have shows on TV and mega churches, and they fly around in private jets, and yet then the church turns its back on poor people. So we have all sort of poverty issues too. So to me, the signs and the wonders that would cause my neighbors to focus and say, I need to sit down and have coffee with you and figure out what makes you tick, because this is really compelling what you're doing, is the signs and wonders of doing the deep work of peace and reconciliation. Healing of the wounds that were caused by Christendom in the first place. And being active agents on the front lines, working to bring people together who are at each other's throats, and doing it unashamedly in the name of Jesus. We're doing this because Jesus is the Prince of Peace. That's why we're doing this. That the love of God binds us together, creating a people who were not a people before. And this is the God that we serve. And so I'm not talking about a vague sort of give peace a chance while we all hum Beatle tunes. I'm not talking about that. So to do this kind of work, which is really, it's the threefold rule of life, let's say, of prayer, hospitality, justice. You have to be a person of deep, discerning prayer to be able to be present to yourself and to your neighbors. This prayer. And then the prayer leads us to practices of hospitality, because we've been praying for our neighbors and we're aware of our neighbors, and God's leading us to be present to our neighbors. So we begin practicing deep hospitality. And out of these practices of hospitality, where we are truly with people and we're truly feeling their pain, the love of God compels us to get involved and to resist evil and injustice. So we become people of action. You can't resist evil and injustice on your own steam very long before you're totally burnt out. It just pulls us back to practices of prayer. So the signs and wonders that will mark the church that's fruitful and confident in sharing its faith. This is a contemplative stance. The signs and wonders come right out of having a contemplative stance with the prayer, the hospitality, the justice. Here are some things that I've written with two of my friends. If you want to read more about some of these themes, I've written other books too. I'll just leave that up there. But I think this is probably a good time to pause and have some conversation.
We have all these very different kind of groups outside the church, but nurtured by it. Do they ever come together at all? Is there ever communication between the pub people and the bikers and the yoga people?
Sometimes.
And might that coming together, might that actually happen within a church building, a church environment? And is it planned?
It can be. That depends on the local church and how it moves forward with this. In this book, I've really laid out how that can happen. But one way that can happen, actually there are decentralized churches that don't have the centerpiece. They have all these, and it's a network of these. And then there may be a clergy person who oversees the teams who lead these different things. So what would happen, you could have a gathering maybe twice a year, bring everybody together from all of the missional communities for a big celebration, worship, a meal, telling of stories. If I was the pastor of this church here, I would want these to all be led by lay people that I've trained. And I would want to have regular meetings with the lead teams from these communities to do ongoing leadership development with them. That's what I would do.
What is happening in the UK in Methodism is that many of the leaders of these are binding together in small groups of what we're calling community practice and sharing their skills, supporting each other, meeting together maybe once every 6 weeks or so. So there's lots of conversation going on between the pioneer type groups. It's certainly at a leadership level at the moment. Whether that's spreading out yet into the actual people who are part of the groups and then mixing together, I haven't picked up yet, but there's a lot going on with those running those groups.
Yes?
I have a problem with being one of the thistle seeds, because being what I am, and a rubbish Christian, really, if you took everything to heart, I will never be a leader of these groups. But I would like to be a thistle seed and spread what I feel about following Jesus, which is terribly important to me. And I just feel that this is an overall savior thing in all aspects of life. But I would need guidance from these different people, or hints that, like, after I've been to the pub, after I've been to the yoga, after I've been to the biker, etc. What can I do? And if I don't get hints from people, I'm at a loss, because sometimes I bring things up and you get that mask. You know, I'm sitting in here and you see this mask come down, and I think, do I shut up? Do I try to explain? It's very difficult, and if you're going to be this, it's going to be this, because that thistle image hit me, you know, and it explodes, spreads everywhere. Well, it can't just come from the leaders of these different groups. The people within those groups have to have some kind of guidance, even if it's just a departing couple of lines as they leave. And I drag certain people along to church, because I really like to go to church on Sunday when I come, and they come. And I went with my friend in California. I live here, I've lived here for a long time. And when it happened to be a Methodist church, the minister turned around as if it was finished, and she turned around again and she says, don't forget when you go out, you are Christ's body and words when you walk out the door. Well, my friend almost swooned over that. And she said to me, I don't go to church, but if I'd go to church, I would come to this church, because that's what hit her. So we need to know little specific things, hints, as we depart from any of these activities. What might be a message to take with us, to communicate with other people?
And you raise a really good issue in the way that you frame this, is that how do we, whether we're a member of one of these or this is where we worship and where we find nourishment, how do we in our day-to-day life share our faith? And so many of us have thought, coming out of where we've come from, that sharing our faith means convincing people of something we want to argue with them about God. Even today, I was in a shop here in town buying a sweatshirt. And I was talking to the shopkeeper. She says, hello, you know, how are you? And she asked, do you live here? I said, no, I live in Texas. And she says, well, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm giving lectures. She said, oh, what are you lecturing about? I said, theology. Don't say evangelism. It's a bad word, right? So I said, theology. And she said, oh, here's the $1 million question. This is a young woman. She's probably 25. I said, what? She said, is there a God? She's asking me, an evangelism professor, is there a God? And I said, there is a God. She says, well, that's a question. I said, I assure you there's a God. And then I chatted with her some more, not about God, but about being here and things like this. I assured her there's a God. So the place where we thought we had to persuade people, we thought that I should have sat down with her with the 4 spiritual laws and threatened her into heaven and away from hell. Or I should have given a list of all of the scientific reasons, sort of pseudo-scientific reasons, Pascal's wager and all this stuff of why she should believe. No, that's not what she needs. What she probably needs, if I had time and I was going to be here, is lunch together or tea or something, and ask her to tell me her story, and then hopefully she would ask me my story, and I could tell her my story, and my story is riddled with God. And I could tell her how God has helped me in my life and how God's given me peace and gives me strength day by day. And even if she asks, well, how do you know that's God? I could tell her how I pray. And so faith sharing, the kind you're asking about, means that we as leaders in the church, pastors, leaders of little congregations, need to help people have an actual prayer life, an actual experience of God, and to get more comfortable just telling their story. There are exercises I do with my students to get better at telling their story. Because we're not trying to convince people in some objective university sense of the existence of God. We're simply sharing our experience of God. And the power of story cannot be overstated. Because people can't tell us, no, you really didn't have that story. You're lying to me. They're not going to say that to us. So helping people have a relationship with God, know how to actually pray, how to be present to other people. This is all part of a contemplative stance, being present, showing up, noticing. This is what people need to learn how to do. And then they'll know how to be present to their neighbors and have these conversations. Yeah. I hope that's helpful.
By the way, just one more comment. When you start off with those 4 laws and
Yes.
having everything else, for a long time, I didn't go to any church because of those laws.
Because of those laws, yeah. You were a lawbreaker.
It was the biggest bit off I've ever had in my life. Anyway,
Yeah.
thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
Thank you for what you've shared this evening. But aren't you asking us to be incarnational again?
I
Just
am.
go back to first principles.
Absolutely.
Be on earth, be on people's houses, eat at their tables, sit at the well, walk through the fields, walk down the road, and if the question and the conversation starts, then respond with your story. I don't wish to oversimplify what you've shared,
That's what it
that's
is.
what I'm taking away from what you've shared.
That is what it is. And it's also about being very present to people.
It's incarnation.
Very present to people. And that's really what the reading you gave us from Luke 10 is really about that. I believe that we are always misguided when we decide we're going to focus on evangelism as if that was the thing. That evangelism is the byproduct of our being loving God with all our heart. Here's the triquetra, the Celtic symbol for the Trinity, right? And we'll put the cross here to remember the incarnation. Can you see this okay?
I'm okay.
All right. So this needs to be the center of our lives, our daily life, our life as a community of faith, our personal life. This is the center, the focus, and our relationship with the Trinity. And then we have all these things that we do out here, various practices. We have practices of hospitality. We have, in the church, we have a practice of preaching. Some people think that church is all about the preaching, especially in the U.S. I run into that all the time. We have acts of mercy. We have works of justice. As Martin Luther King said, mercy is when you pick the man up out of the ditch. Remember the story of the Samaritan? You pick him up out of the ditch and make sure he gets some food and bandages. But justice is when you say, why are so many people being robbed in that street, in that road right there? And then you take on the system that creates so many of these people that need mercy, right? So we've got these different things that we do. I'll put SF for spiritual formation. And as long as God, the three-in-one, is at the center of what we're doing, our focal point, the love of our heart, then all of these works stay in the right place. As soon as, here's where we get off track in the church, is when we say no, we don't even realize we're doing this, we say no, it's preaching that's at the center. And then God sort of gets shifted over here somewhere, and then it's all about the preaching. And when we say evangelism is at the center, which is what we've done when we've done church growth for church growth's sake, that's what we put evangelism at the center, so we can get people and their money and their bodies and all that stuff in the church building, and all will be well. So evangelism is the byproduct of people living wholeheartedly with God at the center of our lives.
I pastor 3 churches here in Cambridge. I think 2 of them can do this.
Uh-huh.
Maybe not doing it all, but we can do that. One's got 5 elderly members. And so as a very normal minister, I sit right at that bottom of the curve where you can see some stuff emerging, but it's really hard to find the time to really focus on that and sit with that. And that sense of pressure and frustration and decline and despair comes through very strongly. So I'd love to spend more time with the people in my churches than the 2 of them are here, who are good lay leaders, even though one denies she is, and who can do this stuff. But it's very difficult because actually some of the patterns of church life we have are still quite program orientated, even in churches which are not mega churches. And actually this need to sit in smaller groups, to be together, those to be safe spaces in which people can be invited, that's very hard to establish in the life of a church, because people are over-occupied sometimes. Keeping the show on the road and doing lots of good things which are about mercy and justice and hospitality and preaching and spiritual formation, but in quite frenetic ways. So what do we begin to change? How do we pull things back? I know covenant discipleship groups and Wesley groups and all that you like, but it's very hard to get those going.
If you do those as just sort of add-ons to everything else that's going on, especially in the situation you're describing, it won't work. So your church with the 5 elderly people may need to just linger on until they're finished. They may not be able to make a shift. But I've actually done this when I was a pastor before I became a professor years ago. I was pastoring a string of 3 churches. They were like the churches from the book of Revelation. There was a hot one, a cold one, and a lukewarm one. They were all there in a row, 5 miles apart from each other. And the one church was very open and receptive. And I would preach the same sermon at each church every Sunday. You know how you do, you kind of drive down. But they were very receptive, and they were just so open. And they were so ashamed of themselves because they didn't have a children's ministry anymore. They didn't have Sunday school. Instead, they kept trying to have a Sunday school. But there was a woman, and her daughter was the only child in the Sunday school. It was like that. And so finally one day she said, I hate to say this, Pastor, but I just hate Sunday school. You know, it's my daughter. I'm with her all the time anyway. I don't see the point. We've tried. And I said, just don't have Sunday school. And she said, what? I said, you don't have to have Sunday school. I can't believe you said that. And so we talked about what is it? What are the gifts that this church actually has? And so we started naming. And I said to her, what would you love to do if you didn't have to do that? What would you love to do? And she said, I would love to do this. And I said, why don't you stop having Sunday school immediately and do that instead? And she did. And it started a chain of events that happened in that church where people stopped doing things they didn't want to do. And they took up things they actually wanted to do. And so this little tiny church out in rural Ohio, now it had the men gathered together, the men, and went and started doing a ministry with this group home where these teenagers that had been in trouble with the law, they started, that's still going all these years later. So they started that ministry, and there's some women that formed a prayer group, and they like it. I think that's still going too. The church never got numerically huge, but it became robust. So I think part of our work is giving permission to stop doing things that aren't working, that they don't want to do, and have some dream time with them. What would you dream of doing if you didn't have to do all that stuff that you're bored with and that doesn't work anyway?
It would be interesting, sorry.
Yeah.
find it difficult and interesting at the same time is that when you are affiliated with a particular form of Christianity, Methodism, Anglican, whatever, it's so easy. It must be difficult to avoid when you're giving a Christian message, not to your congregation in particular, who are already converted to your cause, to not be specific in saying, well, you know, I'm an Anglican, I'm a Methodist, etc. Because what you want is people to come to the Christian church, to come to Jesus, to come to the Christian God, because it's so wonderful. And it is so difficult not to be specific on the branch that you belong to. I mean, there was one particular incident where somebody from the Anglican church, which is almost next door to our Methodist church, came out and said, we had 150 people in church today. We had 3 baptisms. And I immediately felt quite jealous. And then my next reaction, like, well, he's bragging. And then I thought we should both be rejoicing because they had some kind of participation, even if they don't come back, and they don't, because they came together as this Christian fellowship of welcoming people to Jesus. But, you know, these 3 things went flying through my mind, and it's very, very difficult not to sort of evangelize your particular branch of Christianity.
Well, I love Wesleyan theology. That's why I'm Methodist.
Well, me too.
So, which is good, and if you're Catholic and you know, that's fine. But so we do both. As we evangelize people, we help them see the church is very big and diverse, and then appropriately, you know, this is why I like this particular church. And this is why I'm a Baptist or whatever. This is why it makes sense to me. But I recognize that these other traditions are also valid expressions, beautiful expressions of the Christian church. And so you can evangelize someone to a different church than the one you go to. I've done that numerous times. Get them back to the Lutheran church or wherever they came from. The de-churched, right?
So they're the first instance.
Yeah. Yes.
You made a comment in response to one of the earlier questions about how one of the ways to be that thistle seed is just to feel comfortable about, you know, if you encounter someone and you manage to sit down to lunch with them, say, you know, being able to tell your story, not in a specifically kind of, you know, theology way, but you know, tell them your own story, tell them how you pray, etc. Can people be sort of enabled to do that better by being encouraged to do that with each other as a first step within their churches? Because I feel often, even within churches, so some of the folk in the congregations I'm minister of would struggle to do that for each other, and that could perhaps, you know, be a first step to just free them up in that way.
Yes, and I can tell you quickly an exercise you can do in your church with your people to help them kind of get used to the idea. I do this in my evangelism class the first day of every new semester. It's a spiritual direction exercise, but it's, and I approach evangelism through a matrix of Christian spiritual direction and systematic theology, actually. So I ask everyone to give me the name of features of rivers. So why don't you tell me features of rivers? What are some things about rivers?
Waterfalls.
All right. Waterfalls, yes.
Meanders.
Meanders.
Wet.
Flowing.
Okay, what was the other word?
Wet.
They are wet. Sometimes they are dry.
Springs.
Tributaries.
Estuaries.
Banks.
Home to fish.
What was that?
Home,
Oh, the home for the
life.
Okay. Okay, aquatic life. There we go. All the animals that live inside the water. Yes. Plants.
And rubbish.
Rubbish.
Sustaining, because without those rivers, we ain't got no drinking water, nothing.
Uh-huh. They can also be polluted, like the Elk River in West Virginia. How about obstacles in the river? There can be dams. There can be rocks.
Locks.
Weirs.
Locks? What did you say?
Weirs.
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 Weirs?
W-E-I-R-S.
What is that?
It's like
Slow down.
like a mini waterfall.
Sort of
It's
breaks,
to control
breaks the flow.
artificial,
It breaks the flow of the water.
artificial method of controlling the flow of the river.
Just learned a new word. This is a British word, I suspect.
I'm trying to think of what the American word for that was, because I threw that at somebody and they said, oh, you mean something. And I can't remember remember the American word now.
All right, so very good. So you've got this list of things, and you can have your people do this, and then you give them a big piece of paper this size and some markers and a space to work, and you ask them to imagine their life as a river. And they're going to describe their life as a river. They can draw it on there, kind of a map, and from birth till now. And where did they experience waterfalls? Where did they experience a whirlpool? Where did things dry up? Where did something get polluted? What was the rubbish? What was swimming around inside that was lively and, underneath the surface? And let them use that metaphor and give them at least a half an hour to create it. You might even want to give them an hour. This is something you could do over a weekend retreat, a Saturday. And then once they've done all of that, and so what you want them to say is, this is their life, and what is it that brought you to where you are right now in having your spirituality the way it is? Talk about their spirituality. What is it? Then they have to think about their spirituality. But there's something about doing this sort of right brain activity that draws on a different part of the brain. It's not about doctrines and treatises or anything like this. It's a different way of thinking. And it pulls things up at a deep level. And so they get all of their maps, their river maps done, and then put them in groups of 3. And give them each 10 minutes to tell their story. Tell them, be very disciplined about your time, and while you're telling your story, the job of the other 2 people is to listen well. To not interrupt, to listen well. At the end of the 10 minutes, they can ask you 1 or 2 clarifying questions, but that's it. Nobody gets to tell you anything. So you're simply practicing telling your story and listening to the story. You can tell anything that you want to. You don't have to tell anything you don't want to. You get to choose what it is on the map that you talk about. So I take my students through this exercise. They do their triads, and it's always mind-blowing for them. And these are theology students. And many of them have never told their story. Some of them didn't think they had a story to tell, but everybody has a story that's sacred. So then after they do all that, I gather them back in the plenary, and I talk about I ask them, what did that feel like to listen to other people's stories? And have them give me some feedback. How did that feel? And then I ask them, how did it feel to tell your story to those other 2 people? What did that feel like? And they talk about that. And then we have some conversation about what are some good guidelines for us when we're telling our story and when we're listening to other people's stories. What will help us with this? Usually we come up with some good boundary ideas. How much of my story I share with this person is going to be different than how much or what particular thing I share. We don't need to share the whole thing every time we share. So just kind of use this as a time to help them get used to telling their story and get some good guidelines. And I found that this exercise is really quite life-changing for many people. So that's an exercise that you can use. You're welcome.
I found it really refreshing, and
Oh,
thank you so much. And I didn't really realise there's a Mission Shape Ministry course that's open to everybody
good.
locally, and I've done it.
Great.
And I've got a fresh expression that's how Leeds locally in one of the villages. And all the stuff you've been saying is just fabulous, and really has affirmed for me as a layperson just what you can do.
Yes. Thank you. I'm grateful for your feedback. As a layperson, I planted faith communities for years before hadn't even gone to college yet. And this is long ago. So I know that lay people are capable of doing marvelous ministry, of leading faith communities, of developing other disciples. All of the original apostles were lay people. Jesus was a layperson. So we can do this, right?
We have messy church,
Yes.
which I guess is one of those possible forms of fresh expression.
Yes.
And there are certainly members of the congregation of the, shall we say, the regular church who are saying, you know, when are we going to be seeing these people from messy church coming to proper church?
To the real church, yes.
Yeah. What do we say? I mean, I'm saying to them really that, you know, messy church is their church.
Okay.
They're feeling kind of, I guess, pretty holy, actually, just coming across our threshold and being inside our building.
Yes.
And they're, you know, it could be years, if ever, before they come to Sunday morning at 10:30.
And why should they? I mean, honestly, there's nothing magical about Sunday morning at 10:30, right? So here's what we have to do to help the church get around this, because they haven't studied these things. They only have their experience to go on. So we need to do leadership development and teaching with our churches. Everything I've done with you tonight is something you can take on to your church. You can do some training with your church. You can put things in the newsletter. You can have small groups. You can have weekend retreats. When people sit in your office, you could draw a picture on the napkin of the church like I showed you.
Yeah.
You can do that. It's an educational process. Part of the big shift is away from thinking that church is Sunday morning inside a building for an hour. No, church is a community of people who become the bread and wine in the world. So all the different ways that we need to teach this, and we have to say it over and over, we have to live it, we have to show them how to do it. Be very patient, because why would people know this if they've never been taught this before? So that's the work that we have before us.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, thank you for your engagement and your good questions and being friendly. That's always helpful.